Hi there and welcome to another Blender tutorial. In this video, I'll show you how I create low-poly-ish 3D hair in Blender, from modeling to rigging to texturing. This is somewhat of a more informal bonus video to my Blender tutorial series from earlier this year, and it incorporates a lot of the information that I covered there. Alongside that, this tutorial isn't meant for complete beginners, so if you're looking to learn the basics of low-poly-ish modeling, I recommend you check out that series for yourself. I cover a lot of those basics over there, and this tutorial will make much more sense if you're already on a first-name basis with Blender. It's hotkeys and character modeling as a whole. Feel free to slow down the video and follow along if that helps you. The hotkeys that I'm using in this video will be shown in the bottom left corner as well. And remember, everything becomes easier with practice and patience. So with that out of the way, let's jump straight in. I'll start with sketching out some ideas and a turnaround sheet. For my turnarounds, which are flat model sketches, I use Procreate and its symmetry function. This symmetry can be set up in any drawing program though. I always kind of mess around and experiment in a free flow way with my designs, but for this video I went a little bit extra and added a bunch of details to show you different ways of modeling and rigging hair. Alright, jumping to Blender, let's start modeling the hair. For this video, I'm using my base I created, and I begin by dragging in the turnaround sketch. After resetting its rotation and location, I rotate and scale it so it fits the shape of the body and head nicely. Lower down the opacity of the sketch so it doesn't stand out too much, and move it backwards so it doesn't clip through the model. When modeling hair, I mainly use planes. So bringing a plane in, I will usually line it up with the hair strand on the sketch the best I can, and then size it appropriately. I then add some loop cuts, around 4 or 5, and in side view manually move them with the proportional editing turned on so they loosely follow the shape of the head. After lining it up, I'll size the loop cuts so the strand looks more natural. Add another loop cut in the middle and then move it slightly forwards to give the strand more volume. When I model hair, I always start with the fringe first, strand by strand. Some of them, like the side pieces here, are symmetrical, and for this I use the mirror modifier, with the head set as the mirror object. I try and make sure that the pieces of hair look like they're growing out of the head like they would in real life, either out of the same clump or alongside a hair parting. Try and find some reference from real life, or I don't know, take a photo of your hair to see how it works to make sure that it makes sense on the model. It's always a good idea to keep rotating the pieces of the fringe on the z-axis as you keep adding them, so that they frame the face of the character. Otherwise, all the pieces will face forwards and look awkward, flat, and unnatural. For thicker hair parts, I sometimes use cubes instead of planes. The process of modeling the cube is the same, as at the end of the day, it's just a three-dimensional plane which you can extrude and which has thickness that you can manipulate. To make the end of the hair strand pointy, I merge all the vertices on the last extruded face at the center. When it comes to longer hair parts, I usually duplicate them and rotate them on the z-axis to frame the head of the character. I'll change some of the details here and there, like the width or thickness. For the space buns, I use a cube with an applied subdivision modifier. After the overall shape of the hairdo is created, I put a solidify modifier on all the planes that I have modeled, not the cubes. In this case, the planes are the fringe hair parts. For this to work properly, make sure that you have applied scale on all hair objects. Next, I edit the details of each strand of hair, making sure that they don't overlap too much and that there's no gaps in between. When making braids, I usually go the abstract route and create them out of separate objects, like spheres or, in this case, elongated cubes. They don't have to be connected, and this applies to any part of the hair, really, because you'll be able to connect them later by using a rig and some weight painting. Here I make sure I name all the objects appropriately. You can group rename them by pressing Ctrl F2. In this next and last part, I smooth out all the strands of the hair with the use of the shrink and flatten function. First, I add another loop cut that runs through the side of the hair object, select the front-facing edge of the strand, and then use the shrink flatten while pressing Shift. This way you can gently round out the hair without it losing too much volume, and without adding any more topology. I do the same thing to all the hair strands. You don't have to do this if you prefer your hair to look a bit more blocky, but this is how I usually like it. I sharpen some of the edges, like the back rim of the hair strand, and some of the folds to make it look nicer. Smoothing all the strands out from the fringe to the back of the head, I try and make sure that the top of the head stays tidy and change the topology in some places to get rid of the appearing bald spots. The absolute last thing that I do is cleaning up the minuscule details of how and where the hair strands touch and intersect. I like them looking super neat, and to avoid faces clipping into each other, I try and line up all the loop cuts so that it looks like it's one continuous loop cut around the head. I then use the snap function and snap some vertices to other neighboring vertices or edges. I do this until everything looks somewhat clean and tidy, and I'm happy with the result. After modeling, I start working on the rig. Yet again, if you're confused about rigging, please watch my rigging tutorial, as this is basically the same base rig that I'm starting with here. First, turn on snapping to the center of the volume. This will ensure that all the bones automatically snap to the center of the volume of the object. I duplicate my head bone, reset its parent, reparent it to the head, and rotate it upside down. From that point onwards, I line up that bone 1 or 2 loop cuts away from the root of the hair strand and then start extruding alongside the curve of that strand. To rig all the objects, I duplicate the first bone in the chain, the one that's already parented to the head bone, and extrude more bones from there. I try and make sure that there's one bone per row of faces, but sometimes I will skip one row or two if it looks like there's too many bones in the chain. I kind of explained this in my rigging video, but I usually don't start my hair chains too close to the scalp of the character. The first 2 or 3 rows of faces will be solely affected by the head bone, and due to the way I set up constraints here later, all the bones in the chain except for the first and last will be bouncy and move around. I want to make sure that only the middle and ends of the hair are affected by that, so that's why I'll leave the top of the strands out here. You can rig pretty much anything you want with that constraint logic in mind, like I do here with the buns and the braids, but it's important to note that this isn't necessary at all if you're using like real-time physics. I don't, so this is how I do it. I select all the bones I want to mirror, set their names to auto-name left and right, and then hit symmetrize. Weight painting hair is super simple. When I weight paint hair, I use basically exclusively gradients, which you can do by pressing Shift A. The area before the hair chain begins will be fully affected by the head bone only, like I said before. From then onwards, I paint the strand in rows, so that each section of the chain affects the corresponding row of weight. I make sure all the gradients are smooth and not too sharp, so that the deformation looks nice and rubbery. This process gets so much easier with practice. For comparison, when I first started learning 3D, this would take me hours to complete, whereas now it takes me like 15 minutes max, and this is overall a mindless and therapeutic process, to be honest. Keep practicing and looking at how different people approach it in their own different ways. This will help you figure out the best workflow for you. And this doesn't just apply to weight painting, it applies to everything. When it comes to objects that are attached to the head, like these space buns, I make it so that the second bone in the chain affects the entirety of the object. So I fill it with the maximum strength by pressing Ctrl X. You can use gradients on here too if you wish, or use just one bone for the entire object, but yet again, I will explain why I do this when we look at the constraints. Oh, how convenient, here are the constraints. In pose mode, I select the last bone in the chain, shift select the next bone, shift Ctrl C, and then choose down track. This will apply the constraint from the first selected bone onto the second selected bone. Lower the influence to somewhere around 5 or lower. Repeat this for all the bones in the chain except for the last bone, making it so only the first and last bones in the chain don't have any constraints on them. Repeat the same process for all the chains. If you want the hair to be less bouncy, lower the influence even more to around 3. So I use downtrack constraints a lot when it comes to hair, clothes, and accessories that would be affected by physics in real life. Saying that these constraints are not meant to be real-time physics, this is just a life hack to fake those physics. It's important to state that this isn't super reliable either, as these constraints can glitch out sometimes, especially if you render in cycles. So, this is purely for fun, and I wouldn't recommend doing this if you're exporting the character into a game engine and, Here's a rigged and flowy hair. Wow, look at her go. Next, I unwrap the hair. To start, I create a new material and set an image texture as the base color. I then create the image, which will be the hair texture. Dimensions I use are 1024 by 1024 pixels, and make sure you lower your alpha to 0 as well. The type of UV I use are usually color grid, and I then choose that image as the base color of the material. From here, I start unwrapping the hair strands. Usually I follow the same method with all of the strands, marking the edge that runs on the side of the objects as one big seam that separates the hair object into 2 identical-ish islands on the UV map. This is so that I can line them up on top of each other later, to use the same part of the texture. I tend to not be super precious with UV unwrapping, to be honest. As long as there's not intense stretching, I'm usually happy with the island looking somewhat wonky, but arranging them nice and tidy on the UV map is a must. After everything's unwrapped, set the type of the UV to blank and export the UV layout. I texture my models in Photoshop, but honestly, any other drawing program does the job. I start with filling out the flat colors of the hair and accessories first, and separate them into layers depending on how I want to paint them. All these layers will be kept underneath the layer with the UV islands on it. Painting textures is an extremely subjective thing. Everyone draws and paints differently, you know? You might be more into cell shading or pixel art, but personally I am a digital painter, so I love to render out my drawings in a smooth painterly style with soft gradients and a lack of strict sharp lines. I paint hair very differently for each model. It depends on the color, the style of the model, and genuinely just my mood for that day, but I do follow somewhat of a similar structure. For this, I'm doing a very simple texture as this is mostly just a showcase, not a serious model or anything like that. First, I will paint the shadows. This time, I paint them around the strands, but sometimes I will just paint them on top and bottom of the strand instead. I make the shadows a bit more detailed and try to kind of almost carve out the 3D shape of the strand. I'm choosing the base color again and carve out the shadows even further, detailing the smaller and thinner hair pieces. In my drawing style, I use the eyedrop tool a lot, like almost before every brush stroke. This helps to make the coloring a bit more dynamic, even if I'm basically just using two colors, light and dark blue, just different shades of it. Then I briefly mark where the highlights are going to be on each strand. I choose the base color yet again and do the same process of carving out the details of the highlights. Next comes my favorite part. I use Photoshop's smudge tool to define all the details of the hair. I use the smudge tool a lot when it comes to painting hair details and folds and clothes, but not really on skin or face textures. I took the liberty of very quickly drafting up a simple rough texture for the rest of the body. Excuse the sketchiness of the lines. I did my texture here using this software, but if you want to learn more about how to do this to your textures, I recommend you watch my texturing tutorial. And here we are. She's alive! When it comes to other types of hair, like black hairstyles for example, you can use different shapes to make the hair from. In these examples, I use cylinders instead of planes and cubes to create dreadlocks. These hairstyles follow the exact same structure, simple objects that are scaled, extruded, and rotated to frame the shape of the head and face. And then you just tidy up the hair parting to make sure that it just looks, nice and natural on the top of it. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. Super short hair can be made out of thin, solidified planes, and braids can be made out of spheres. Here's my Personas model and its simple hair rig as well. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you find yourself having questions about the details of anything I covered here, please check out my 3D character tutorial series, or take a look at the playlist I made with a bunch of useful Blender tutorials. I'll link that in the description. Thank you so much to my members and patrons. Your support means the absolute world, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!